everybody. Thanks for joining us for Facebook Live. My name is Rachel. I'm the Animal Care Supervisor of Ectotherms at Naples Zoo. And a lot of times when I say that, people have questions like, what is an ectotherm? Ectotherms are another term for cold-blooded animals. And a lot of times we don't call them cold-blooded because it isn't really the best terminology to use for them. But there are a lot of different types of cold-blooded or ectothermic animals. So we have reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and invertebrates. And today we're going to talk about invertebrates and what they are. Now there's lots of different types of invertebrates. I brought out a few different things just to kind of give some examples today. So obviously a lot of different insects. We've got arachnids like scorpions and spiders. Different things that you may find when you're at the ocean or the beach, like different shells, mollusks. There's a ton of different types of invertebrates. But today we're going to focus on arthropods. So arthropods are actually a huge group of animals. There's over 1 million species of arthropods out there, so there are quite a few. We are obviously not going to get into very many today. We've got just a few at the zoo that we would like to talk about. And we are going to specifically talk about some of the ones that we have here in the gift shop, and also that we have kind of behind the scenes doing some other things. And something that I often will say, and I'd like to bring up, is that we often call these guys bugs. If you looked at this table, if you saw a butterfly, a ladybug, a praying mantis, we would probably call these bugs, right? If something lands on you outside, you often say like, oh, a bug landed on me. Well, technically none of these are true bugs. Bugs are only in one little group of animals within the insects. But we're just going to call things bugs today because we don't want to be too specific with our terminology, and that's something that we use to call a lot of these animals, and that's okay. So we are actually going to first get started with a type of arthropod that's in its own little class, its own group, and it's one of my favorites that we have. So I'm going to get one out, and these guys do live in the gift shop. Hello. Now I know a lot of times when people see different animals that have a lot of legs like arthropods do, they have all these different body segments, they have this outer hard shell, all those characteristics of arthropods, it can make people nervous, and that's understandable. But that's why I like to bring out this guy here. This is an African giant millipede, and we do have these typically hanging out in our gift shop. We actually have a lot of millipedes, but often you may only see one or two because they are pretty secretive animals. And these are animals that you could see here in Florida, not this particular species. They're only found in the rainforest in Africa, but we have a ton of millipedes throughout the world. And they look a lot like their close relative, this is not real, but a centipede. Now, there is a big difference between centipedes and millipedes, and that has to do with really what they eat and how they defend themselves. Because centipedes have these really large jaws. They have basically large jaws at the front of their face so that they can protect themselves, and also for hunting, because centipedes will eat other insects, other bugs, things like millipedes, and the millipedes just eat vegetation. So he's just kind of making his way along here, and you'll probably be able to see maybe some of the characteristics on him as we talk about them. But you can see that I'm not concerned about him biting, and that's because he has really small mouth parts that he uses to eat the vegetation, like fallen leaves and things like that. But all animals have to be able to defend themselves. If a predator comes along, what the millipede will probably do is just coil up into a really tight ball. So you could see when I first got him out, he was a bit nervous. He had part of his body coiled. And that's what they would do in the wild, except really just tighten their body into a little ball so that nothing could mess with them. Then if a predator continued to try to mess with that millipede, they actually have a toxic little chemical that can actually come out through the sides of their body. And like I said, everything has to be able to defend itself. So hopefully for the millipede, if a predator comes, won't leave it alone, it can have that chemical come out and just makes it taste really bad. And then likely that animal will go, "Ooh, no thank you," and drop it, and then the millipede will go about its day. Now, millipede actually means 1,000 legs. And we don't actually have millipedes with 1,000 legs, but they do have quite a few, especially once they're pretty large like this guy. They can reach 12 inches long, and they continue to add legs throughout their lives. So they do that by molting, which is another really big thing that all arthropods do. And that's really similar to how a snake or lizard will shed its skin, except they only molt a certain number of times throughout their entire life. And they have one big shell that they molt out of. Often if we think of a crab, if you've ever seen like a molt from a crab, I actually have a molt from, this is a molt from a roach that we have here at the zoo. So those exoskeletons get shed off, and then they've got new body underneath. And that's how they add their legs. So every time they molt, we get tons more legs added to these guys. And like I said, by the time they're adults, they can be 12 inches long, which is huge. These are the largest species of millipedes out there. And here in Florida, we don't have millipedes anywhere near this size. They are pretty small, maybe only like this big compared to him. But they do the same roles that these African giant millipedes do. And that's by breaking down a lot of the vegetation, the leaf litter, things that if there weren't animals to help control some of that, it would really get out of hand. Think about every year how many leaves drop off of our trees, even here in Florida where we don't have that many trees dropping leaves. And so if there weren't animals and other critters to break down some of that, it would be a huge problem. So millipedes are really important in all of the different ecosystems that they're found in.
We do have a question from Cadence. She wants to know, do you have a favorite bug?
Ooh, do I have a favorite bug? Honestly, probably millipedes and something called an isopod. And that's just because I've been around these guys since I was little. My mom was a biologist, so she showed me what animals it was safe to go out and carefully interact with. And some of those were the millipedes and the isopods. And so they're really gentle. They aren't harmful as long as we are gentle to them. And so I just really have always loved interacting with them. If we don't have other questions, I can switch out and we'll kind of switch gears from this guy to one of our other really cool bugs that we have here at the zoo. All right. So I'm going to let him go back into his little travel area. Now he's decided he wants to keep hanging out with us. There you go, bud.
Piper, who's 10, says, what's an isopod?
Ooh, what's an isopod? Well, I was going to talk about them last, but we can just go ahead and jump into our isopods. Isopods are a whole nother group. So like I said, millipedes are kind of their own little group of animals within arthropods. So are the isopods. And you've probably seen them out in the wild and maybe not known it. I always called them when I was little roly-polies, and then some people call them pill bugs too. So I will bring those guys out. I've got just a big carrier of some of them. And isopods, well, this is going to be tricky to see, probably, maybe, we'll see. Once they start moving around a bit, you're able to see some of those guys. Yeah, so these are a species called dwarf white isopods. So again, they aren't harmful to us, but they do a really important role in the ecosystem. And normally the ones you could find here in Florida, which we will actually we'll have a video a little bit later today about how you could go out and find some of these guys here in Florida. But like the millipedes, they have a really important role in their ecosystem. So they are detritivores, meaning they're breaking down some of that leaf litter we talked about, and even things like waste from other animals. And initially that might seem a little bit gross that they're going out and eating some of this, decaying matter and waste from other animals. But again, if there aren't critters out doing that for us, then we're going to have a really bad impact in our ecosystem. So they help clean everything up. And so the reason we actually have them here at the zoo is to do that role. These are part of what we call our cleanup crew. And so in some of our smaller enclosures, like for our dart frogs, they are going around doing their thing all day, and we check on them and clean up after them. But there's always going to be tiny things that we're not really able to see as humans. And these guys can help us out by cleaning up some of that. Trying to find some more for you. Let's see, there we go. So while we are still cleaning our enclosures and getting anything that we can see, these guys are running around and cleaning up some of that extra. And so that helps us out because it's just like out in the wild. It helps us to make our enclosures for our animals, our habitats, a lot more natural, which helps keep the animals really healthy. There's a bunch for you guys.
We do have a question, since these guys are pretty small. Legion asks, do you know the smallest bug?
Ooh, I don't know the smallest bug. That's a really good question. There are definitely bugs out there that are so tiny that we can't even really see them. There are things, mites that are actually related to scorpions and spiders that are so tiny you have to use a microscope to look at them. So it kind of depends, what group of animals you're talking about, but that's a good question, and I don't have the answer to that.
And Valentina wants to know, what is the fastest bug you know of?
Ooh, fastest bug. I would say that, I guess it depends if you're talking about crawling or flying. Maybe some of the ones that move the quickest when they're crawling are the centipedes, which are the relatives of the millipedes that I kind of mentioned earlier. We do have those in Florida too. They move very, very fast, and they are hunters, so they run around and actually hunt other bugs for their food. So they're probably some of the fastest, but that's a good question as well. And if we don't have any other questions about these really cool isopods, then I'll bring out our last critter for you guys to see. And I'm going to have to handle him a bit differently than some of our other bugs. And that is because he is a scorpion. And all scorpions and their relatives, the spiders, are venomous. So we have to take certain precautions in order to keep ourselves safe and also make sure that the animal isn't feeling defensive. Because, like we've said, any animal will defend itself if it gets scared. And sometimes if we're this big towering person over a tiny bug, it would be pretty easy to make that bug scared. I think I'm missing one of my little tools here. It probably rolled under my thing. Oh, don't know where it is. So this is our dictator scorpion. He is still pretty young, so he hasn't grown as large as he's going to. And he actually just recently molted. Now I have a molt from one of his previous molts when we first got him, which he was so tiny. He was about the size of my thumbnail when we got him. And then he has molted every so often over the past maybe 2 years, year and a half, and now he's this size here. So scorpions get definitely a bad reputation, just like a lot of our other arthropods, and that's because of that venom and the fact that they can sting. And they can deliver quite a painful sting, but they have to have that sting in order to catch their food out in the wild. So what they would do is just sit and wait. They're ambush predators. Once something comes by them, they would grab it with those pinchers right in the front here, and then they would sting it with their venomous stinger. And so with a lot of these types of animals, scorpions, spiders, animals that could potentially hurt people, it's completely understandable that we get fearful of them. Maybe they're not our favorite animals, but any animal has some of these characteristics, and we just have to know how to be careful with them so we don't make them nervous, and also how important they are out in the wild. Because all of our arachnids, like the scorpions and spiders, they do help keep other prey populations down. Some of those insects, like a cricket, if you think of how many crickets are probably out there, there are scorpions and spiders eating some of those guys. So it really does help us out, again, in our environment, keeping everything under control.
Jimmy has a question. How many different scorpion species do we have here in Florida?
Here in Florida, we have 3 different species of scorpion. They're all pretty small. The only one that I have really heard of people finding is the bark scorpion, so they are really hard to find. And I actually go out and look for bugs, and I still have never seen a scorpion here in Florida. So you aren't likely to see them, but they are there. They're nocturnal, and they like to hide a lot, so that's why we don't see them very commonly.
Owen, who's 5, wants to know, how long do scorpions live?
Actually, that's a good question, because scorpions can live a lot longer than we would think. Some bugs only have very short lifespans, maybe not even a whole year, but scorpions can live over 10 years, sometimes even up to 15. And this species here, this dictator scorpion, is likely going to live 10 or 15 years because it is one of the larger species. He'll be maybe 4 times the size when he's full grown.
Macy and Kyle want to know, what do scorpions eat? I think you briefly talked about it. But
Yeah, so they eat other types of insects. So at the zoo, we might feed them things like crickets or worms, roaches, and they would eat those same things out in the wild as well.
Eleanor and Beatrice want to know, which bugs are poisonous to scorpions?
Which ones are poisonous to scorpions? Oh.
Just
Or-
scorpions? Or which other bugs are?
Okay, good question. So that is something that we'll probably talk about a bit later too, because any animal out there, if you go and pick it up, it could bite, and there are quite a few different types of bugs that have venom, and that's because of what they need to do usually to eat. So scorpions, spiders, a lot of ants, and even if you think about things like bees and wasps, those all have venom too. So there are quite a few different types of arthropods that will use venom or poison as a sort of defense or as how they catch their food. So there are a lot out there.
Eddie, age 8, wants to know, how much do scorpions eat?
Scorpions eat usually actually not that very much. It depends on how old they are. So we feed ours usually 3 times a week, and that depends on a few different factors, but that's pretty typical for him. And then sometimes out in the wild, they might go several weeks without eating, or even months. And I've actually heard of scorpions going a whole year without eating any food.
Cadence is asking if different types of scorpions have different types of venom.
Yes, they do. Good question. Different scorpions do have different types of venom, mostly depending on what sort of insects that they're going to be hunting. And that's true of all venomous animals. So bees and wasps and snakes, they do have venom very specific to what it is that they're trying to eat. Good questions, guys. And he's actually doing really well. He's very calm. If he's feeling defensive or scared, he holds out those pinchers really far. He holds up his tail really high so that he would be ready for anything if something did come towards him.
Legion wants to know, how long can a scorpion get?
It is a bit tricky with them because they do include their tail. And so for him, I would say, he's only maybe this long with his body, but they do include his tail as well. So there are some scorpions that get 8 or 9 inches long, but that's going to be the tail included. So usually for us, it doesn't actually appear quite as long as they really are, since they often hold their tails up. All right, so we're going to give him his little hide back, so if he does want to go back in there, he can. And I really want to thank you guys so much for joining us today and talking about some of my favorite creatures. I love working with arthropods and other bugs. I think that it's a really misunderstood group of animals, but you guys had really good questions for us today. And so what we're going to do later is actually post a video on how we can go out and safely meet some bugs out in the wild here in Florida while we're at home just looking at different things about them. And so look out for that on our Facebook group, and we'll see you guys later. Thank you so much.